Good morning, everyone. So excited to have you all here. Um, as you can see, we can see everyone on the call. Sorry, this isn't a webinar format, but we will be presenting today, and I'm going to wait a little bit longer for some more people to jump on. Okay, well, welcome everyone. We'll let people still come on board. Thank you for joining us for the last day, I believe, of Soil Health Week 2026. I know there's a lot of you joining us from outside of Illinois, which is okay because both of our speakers this morning are, as well as am I. I'm currently in Missouri. And we're going to be talking about a really interesting historical concept today and relating it to um, what's going on the landscape today. And I have just loved working with these two folks and getting to know them a little bit more. And I'm sure you're going to learn a lot from them. And we've just been nerding out on the Prairie State Forestry Project in every conversation we've had. So I hope you get as inspired as we have been getting inspired by um, the past and this project that happened. So I'll introduce our speakers today. We have Sarah Carley, who's an associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And she is also the director of the LEAF initiative, which is Learning Environments for All to Flourish. LEAF. Her research explores how landscape design and infrastructure support ecological health, including work on nature-based learning environments for children and the Prairie State Forestry Project archive, which documents the historic Shelterbelt system developed to reduce soil erosion across the Great Plains. So that's what we're going to be talking about a lot today. And also joining us is Gary Bentrup. He is a research landscape planner at the USDA National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln, Nebraska as well. His research focuses on developing resources for designing multifunctional agroforestry practices. He considers his destiny to be in agroforestry, having grown up in his family's farm's Shelterbelt in western Kansas. So thank you for joining us, Sarah and Gary. We're so excited to have you, and I'll let you take the lead from here on out.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This is a really fascinating historical project, and it really sets the groundwork for some exciting contemporary work. So we'll be giving a brief overview of the project. The images that we'll be showing are part of our digitally accessible, publicly accessible archive. So we'll be encouraging you to do your own research on the project yourself. And then we'll be opening for questions on the impacts of the project as seen by MJ and Gary. Yeah, I think, are you next
Yep.
slide maybe?
Yep.
So the Prairie States Forestry Project is a New Deal project, and it's one that's not very well known. It today remains the largest afforestation effort in the United States, where more than 30,000 landowners planted over 200 million trees as part of a federally coordinated shelter belt system designed to stabilize soil and confront wind erosion. The planting did occur at a national scale, and its magnitude alone demands attention, not simply as a conservation history, but as a soil infrastructure embedded in the plains. Public representation, as the images that you're seeing on the screen, represent the Prairie State Forestry Project, often portraying the Great Plains as a landscape in need of trees, as seen in the New Deal poster, as well as the parades that were exhibited. Yet our archival records reveal a much more complex effort focused on wind erosion, species experimentation, and large-scale nursery production. Before it became a federal policy, shelter belt planting was a research question. Foresters, agronomists, and experimentation stations had studied windbreaks for decades. testing species, spacing, orientation, and survival. By the 1930s, there was already evidence that trees could reduce wind velocity, trap snow, and stabilize soil. What changed was not the science, but the scale. The research became policy, and experimentation became infrastructure. Carrie, would you like to say anything about this interesting archival resource?
Yeah, yeah. So that QR code there on the left is will take you to this publication. And it's a really, I mean, I know we're Prairie States Forestry Project kind of geeks, but it is a really fascinating document that outlines the kind of the history that led up to the project, the kind of the research that was done and so forth. Because there was actually research. We have a Forest Service publication that was printed in 1911 that was already documenting the research that was occurring in the late 1800s and early 1900s regarding the biophysical effects of these shelter belts. So if you want to learn more and see more, I would click on or use that QR code.
Great. Next slide. One of the things that we wanted to point out is the Great Plains is not a single fixed region. Geographers have identified more than 50 defining boundaries across the central United States. And for the Prairie State Forestry Project specifically, the planting zone was defined not by culture or state lines, but by wind, rainfall, and erosion risk. The project stretched from the Texas Panhandle to the Canadian border, including states like Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. In fact, it was a climactic boundary turned into policy. And the image on the right is the first image printed for the project in the New York Times, announcing the idea for the project. And you can see the planting zone as the dark, thick zone right in the middle of the United States, running the length of those 6 states.
And you can kind of see from that map, because it's a rainfall map, when they picked that zone, they were kind of thinking that was about the farthest west place where they had enough precipitation to hopefully get these plants to take, because there wasn't really going to be probably that much supplemental irrigation, especially at that time.
And then one of the things to just recall is the Prairie States Forestry Project is typically understood as a response to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Dust storms during that decade were severe and deeply disruptive. At the same time, environmental history research shows that wind and dust have been a long ecological feature of the Great Plains. What made the 1930s so catastrophic was the combination of prolonged drought, economic hardship, and widespread land disturbance. The Shelterbelt project emerged as just one response to reduce risk in a landscape shaped by wind.
And I think this archival photo from on the right really kind of shows the dilemma that these producers were facing during this time. I mean, it's the grapes of wrath, really, where people had to like almost walk away from these farms because they were no longer even could get sell them.
These are some of the original maps that were developed by the Forest Service to detail out the planting zone, as well as looking at windbreak or shelterbelt plantings at a county scale. So you're going to see the detail of each windbreak through different scales of maps, all the way down to species selection. And one thing that's really unique is the project was very ambitious and it was implemented very rapidly. And funding was limited. So the program moved forward at this scale through what was called cooperative agreements with landowners. Participation did vary across counties, and we'll show some participation variants, particularly in Nebraska, which were reflecting local priorities and conditions for planting. Scientific research informed the effort through soil vegetation and wind suitability maps, which are the 3 maps that you're looking at. But each shelter belt was ultimately shaped by the ground it was planted on, and it was in collaboration and the decision of the landowner.
Yeah, these as landscape architects, we particularly get excited by these maps. There's about 14 of these large scale maps. They're about 18 inches by 3 feet. And they're, we're really to try to decide where within the shelter belt zone to concentrate efforts. And this is one of the first probably examples of what we call an overlay system, or kind of almost now we use GIS to do that, where we use different geospatial layers to layer things and kind of sort things out. But they had both erosion reconnaissance in here, natural vegetation. They had some economic data layers, as well as like where were the dominant winds. So it's really exciting to see this project was pretty groundbreaking and doing large scale precursor GIS assessments. And then another note on this is the map on the far right is one of the county maps from this project. And they meticulously drew on all these county maps where they put in these shelter belts. And the colors, they're all in colored pencil. The colors correspond to the year that it was implemented. And so there's these great map documents of all the counties in the project area with these colored pencil location maps.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. That was great. And they are all done by hand, so they are really beautiful. So thank you for the kind comment or the kind compliments in the comments. What we're looking at right now is what a typical artistic representation was on the top versus what was actually planted on the right. So as Gary mentioned, they were a regional design framework which guided placement, but implementation occurred one farm at a time. At the regional scale, planners developed spacing and protection assumptions on how wide strips should be, how far apart, and how far the wind protections might extend. At the local scale, the framework was translated into township and farm layouts. Local administrators worked directly with landowners to position tree strips within existing field systems and property boundaries. Soil stabilization depended on both this centralized planning informed by data and site-specific knowledge informed by landowners.
I think the slide on the right, or picture on the right, kind of is a conceptual illustration, but it does really actually demonstrate kind of what ended up on the landscape. There was a survey of the windbreaks after they were kind of implemented a couple years in, and they found like about 57% of them were about a half mile in length, and that corresponded to the farm size, so a 160-acre farm. And then other times they were around like about 22% were about a quarter mile in length, and that corresponded more to a 40 or 80 acre farm. And more often than not, they were a single leg, but in some cases they were an angle leg to provide more protection, or people who were growing more sensitive crops did actually implement them on what we kind of think about like so many intervals of tree height downwind to provide that extra protection.
So we're going to walk you through an example of one shelter belt. This is Art Hemrick Shelter Belt in Antelope County in Nebraska. And one of the things that's so interesting within the archival research is you can see what the initial planting list was. And during the project's period, they documented even replacement planting. So they were keeping track of the success rate of species. One thing that did happen was once the program ended, the documentation and coordination did not continue. So as a result, the precise location and current condition of many historic shelter belts became uncertain over time, and much of the original archival material was dispersed or left unpreserved, which became one of the goals for Gary and I was to preserve it, digitize it, and make it accessible for long-term research and impact.
I think the record of the individual strip really highlights kind of an interesting and key point about the shelter belts that were being implemented with this project. Um, the rows kind of varied everywhere from a single tree or single row all the way up to 23. But the bulk were, on one estimate, about 56% were in that 10 row planting, which is what this documentation actually shows. And usually there was around 5 to 8 different species within these plantings, although they actually tried quite a few different ones, some not in many cases, but and then usually rows were about 8 to 10 feet apart, sometimes up to 12. Each row is spaced pretty much the same distance for all the rows. And then in-row spacing was typically around 4 to 8 feet, often around 6 for trees. And then shrubs were around 2 to 4 feet spacing.
And this is the same family. And so, one of the things that is really interesting within the archive is that there are also images of people. So, our ability to digitize the project was preserving more than just the paperwork. It preserves knowledge about the strategy and the people that participated. By making these documents accessible, we can better understand how the shelter belts were designed, as well as how they continue to shape agricultural land today. So you're looking at the family that participated in planting that original shelter belt. And to the right is what that original shelter belt system looked like in 2017. One of the things we did through a colleague at the National Agroforestry Center was to digitize the archival records and identify exactly how many shelter belts were planted and where were they planted within each county. This is an example of Nebraska. And by mapping these documents, we were able to locate and link historic records as well as with current imagery. So we'll be showing you a few of those slides later. And this made it possible to identify which belts remained and to better understand how the original investment might continue to shape soil and wind conditions. So, one of the things that's interesting to Gary and I, 1939 was one of the heaviest planting years in Nebraska. But something else that's interesting, the western counties in Nebraska are not part of the original planting zone. And so we've been digging through our research to figure out why those counties decided to participate. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Gary.
Sure. We haven't done a deep dive yet on it, but well, one, I think it speaks to the program that folks outside of the actual official zone petition basically to be involved. And so that's interesting. And then I think too, why we see that interest, it's a very more arid zone. The project planners, were concerned about going that far west because of would you have enough precip to have the planting survive. But some of the monitoring that did occur later does indicate that plantings actually did pretty well there. But I think the interest was driven a little bit by it was, this arid area was also susceptible to wind erosion. There was a bit of sugar beet production in this area, which tends to leave soils more exposed just by the nature of that crop. But this just kind of highlights all the interesting kind of questions that we can kind of go back in and start to tease apart with this now archive being available and digitized and cross-reference.
Yeah, so this is the archive, and we'll be sharing a QR code if you want to access it. And right now, it's in collaboration with the Center for Digital Research at the University of Nebraska and the USDA National Agroforestry Center. And we've digitized over 20,000 archival records. If you go to the next slide, One of the things that we did want to point out within our data set is the Northern Plain states are really well documented. So we have great archival records for Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. But the same record source was not provided for the Southern Plain states, which would have been Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So we're still on the hunt for those records. And if we do come across them, we plan to add them to our archive. And then the last slide of this just provides access for anyone that's interested. You can go to the website or you can scan the QR code and explore the records yourselves or possibly search for family who may have participated. So we are very excited to share this resource and we hope you enjoy it as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the introduction to the Prairie State Forestry Project, as well as the digital archive that you all have come across. I know many of us at Savannah Institute were eagerly awaiting the archive to be released for several years. So it's great that we're sharing that with everyone. So when I first reached out to Sarah and Gary, I had a few questions for them, and they so graciously said, "Okay, we'll try to answer your questions, MJ." So, um, for the rest of this webinar, I'm going to ask some questions, and then after that, we'll do some that are in the chat. So my first question to them was, how effective were these shelter belts at reducing soil erosion? I know there was other practices that were done to mitigate the Dust Bowl and help the farmers in that farmland area. So how much did the shelter belts contribute to the soil erosion problem?
That's a great question, MJ. I mean, and there's like anything, there's a lot of facets to it, as we can imagine. The particular Dust Bowl era, as Sarah alluded to, was a combination of economic factors, some farming practices at that time, speculation in agriculture, climatic conditions and things. And so, when we say the effective, there was also a bit of shift in some of the weather factors and other factors that contributed to it. But, first, I think to tease that question apart is how well did they grow? I mean, that's kind of the fundamental first part. Then can we answer the erosion piece? And there was a survey done in 1944 where foresters went through and sampled 3% of the 220 million trees, which is a phenomenal amount, in my opinion. They went across like 93 counties in all the states. In the sample, basically the average age was 6.5 years old planting. And here's kind of the results. They had a couple, they rated these shelter belts based on survival, growth rate, vigor of trees, continuity of the belt. And we can see that well over three-fourths of the plantings were in good to excellent condition, which is, to me, a pretty phenomenal rate. And really less than 10% were in that very poor or absent category. So, here's an example, a picture from the archive, and that's a tree 4 years old in Nebraska, which was actually really kind of amazing. Oh, and I want to say, for those that are really interested in the project, this paper, you can go to the QR code. It's available. It's a really fascinating summary of this inventory effort that they did. A lot of great detail there. So on the erosion piece, we already know from the research that was even conducted prior to this project that the windbreak, depending on porosity and design and height of it, will greatly reduce that erode or wind speed and ultimately erosion downwind, even a little bit upwind as well. And here it kind of just shows you the reduction in wind speed. Usually we talk about windbreaks being about eight to 10 tree heights, the maximum tree height in the shelter belt, of being effective for that kind of erosion protection. Um, and so I think to kind of maybe bring home that the effect on erosion, this again from the archive, here was a producer in South Dakota. He was pretty much ready to walk away from his farm. Like I said, they didn't even couldn't sell them. But he implemented a windbreak and a 13 row one with a 90% survival. And this is the same field in that. And he was growing some truck crops as well. And, I think all in all, it was pretty successful in that regard from that question.
Wow, that before and after picture is incredible.
Carrie, one question, and I have a little bit of data on this. I think Thomas was asking about what planted species were either most planted or most successful, and it does vary by state. I don't know if you want to comment on that or if you want me to just comment on what we're seeing in the archive.
I kind of anticipated that a little bit.
Yeah.
MJ, I'm sorry you didn't know. I went in and actually added some slides on
Oh,
the
okay.
species. And so maybe we'll hold that and maybe we'll have time to
Okay.
get to that in the open question. Because I
Sure.
think it's a great question because, yeah, there were some dominant species that were used, but they actually tried a lot of different species, more than I ever had a guess on.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, if we want to hold that one and come back to that, because it comes out of that inventory report and gets into some of the survivability and growth on those.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one thing the archive is highlighting to us is the sort of range of things that were actually tested.
Cool. Well,
Okay.
we're going to shift a little bit more to the people side again for this next question. I know we're in the midst of a lot of this in the agroforestry world today, finding champions for these kind of projects. Who were the champions of this prairie project?
Yeah, I'll start out first and then Sarah can add to it. And, as Sarah mentioned, this really was both a bottom up and a top down approach, which I think is kind of intriguing, in that it was federally administered by the U.S. Forest Service in conjunction with the CCC. But the counties had to invite you in. The feds didn't just come marching in. And, a lot of the farmers and the people locally, you know, they were in dire straits and were really advocating for this. So there was really this, I think, farmer interest as well as community interest. Um, Another slide, we've seen this one already, but we had this, it was even involved in parades. And I think this quote out of a paper from 1940 kind of demonstrates that communities and organizations were also pretty supportive and were leveraging a lot of resources into it. For example, 57 trucks were loaned to the project. People were providing drivers, paying operation costs. They were providing storage facilities and other kind of infrastructure, leveraging, that federal investment. And so I think it did really come from a lot of sources. And then last, I think, this was a project pushed by the New Deal by FDR and had a lot of administrative support. And I think this quote by First Lady Eleanor is pretty intriguing. She visited a shelter belt in 1936 as part of the campaign. And she had this quote, "It's very important that school children be given the opportunity to learn all they can about growing trees, since tree growing should be a vital part of farm operations." Um, so,
That's beautiful. I agree with that first lady. Okay, well, I know also FDR was a huge forester and managed a large property in New York growing up, and he was really about planting trees as an extra additional solution that could take place besides converting a lot of the land back to grasslands, which I see people are commenting in the chat,
Mhm.
um, which is also important. We need more perennials on this landscape. So, what were some of the after effects, though, about planting these trees, this afforestation type of project? What were the good, the bad, the ugly from this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. And I think, what it's a balanced question. And like with most projects, there's always some trade-offs. But we really like this picture from the archive, and there's multiple pictures like this, and I don't think they were really that staged. I think people were picnicking in their Shelterbelt. I mean, I know that was my playground as well as we did family picnics in our Shelterbelt around our farm. So, um, but
Good
taking
to
the
hear.
step back on the positive side, I think we've demonstrated that there was consistent erosion control. One of the value of um, a perennial practice like shelter belts is it can provide year-round protection, uh, given in all types of kind of weather event years. So whether you've got kind of a wet year or a dry year, you've got that shelter belt providing that kind of protection where some practices might be more vulnerable to a drought and may not take cover, like, say, for instance, a cover crop. There's also, which isn't always talked about as much, but there is crop yield enhancement. We know that a lot of crops get a yield bump through the microclimate benefits that the shelter belts provide. I'll talk a little more on that one when we talk about some of the negative sides. Um, People already were like using these to provide alternative products. So here's a picture on the right of a person who was growing fruit in their shelter belt. Peaches and apricot were actually used as well. People were also putting like honeybee hives into their shelter belt. Um, and then, of course, there was some wildlife habitat benefits, both just for viewing as well as also from a hunting perspective. But of course, there was some negative effects, and some of the ones here include there is a crop yield reduction right next to the windbreak. There's a little sapping zone. It's usually around about zero point 0.5 of the tree height distance out from it, kind of shown in that area of competition where the yields decrease. Of course, where the area is planted to trees, so that yield is zero. But when you move out in that 5 to 8 H zone, there is a bump. Um, Another thing that gets often brought up, and it's a very legitimate issue, is that it did introduce species into the region that weren't necessarily here before, either totally exotic species or species outside the range. And, that always presents some challenges. The picture on the right shows views of Russian olive and actually Siberian elm, not Chinese elm, uh, being used, which um, particularly Russian olive can be pretty aggressive and get along waterways. Red cedar is also, in that case, a natural or native species in the region, but can be very aggressive. So there is that issue. And then, of course, undesirable wildlife predation was another kind of issue. Um, I don't know if any kind of other observations you have, Sarah, on that.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to talk about how they were initially intended to be managed versus
Yeah.
some of the impacts of World War II on managing the shelter belts. So initially, some of the design of the species was for wood, and they were considered to be managed more regularly. but rural electrification came, and then we had the impacts of World War II. And so the initial management of some of these fast-growing species wasn't implemented in the way that it was originally designed.
Interesting.
I think a great point, and just building on that, that's one of the reasons why they were so wide was thinking of actually wood products. Now, when we're thinking about them, these were 10 row typically or wider. When we're talking more soil erosion, maybe crop yield enhancement, research seems to indicate more in that 3 row range is kind of the sweet spot in balancing land out of production and getting the benefits. But that's kind of around just when you're looking at the erosion and kind of crop yield benefits. If you're wanting other benefits, if it's like a shelter belt around a home, there's some reasons why we might still want to go a little wider.
Mhm.
Great. Yeah, I know the wider they are, a lot more larger creatures will also use
Mhm.
those as corridors. So we've kind of touched on this already, but really, can you share a little bit about how many of these shelter belts that were planted during this time period still exist on the landscape? And are they still effective?
Yeah. Um, we'll do our best on that one. I think the jury is still out to some degree. Um, but, I mean, it's hard to believe we're talking now. These tree rows, the ones went in, are now 91 years old. Um, and, for any tree species, especially in kind of harsh climates, that's kind of a while. Um, so to kind of get at that question of what's still out there, a colleague of ours, Richard Carmen, who worked at the National Agroforestry Center, who we owe a lot of debt to for this project in many ways, embarked on a project where he did this just for Nebraska, but he took those county level maps and he digitized them into a GIS database. So the yellow lines indicate all the lines of the shelter belt shown on the map on the left, superimposed on modern day aerial photography. Then he came up with a system of saying, all right, let's just do 3 categories. What is still out on the landscape fully intact? Like what what does looks like it's never been reduced or cut out. And then the middle category is partially intact and then or completely gone. And so partially intact is really illustrated pretty well by this picture where a center pivot carved out a chunk in the middle. And that picture on the right, the aerial, also kind of illustrating that. So he did this for all the shelter belts in Nebraska, and which included over 10,000 shelter belts across the state. And he had aerial photography from 4 time periods, starting back in '03. And when he kind of finished this up, it was in 2016. So up to 80 years ago, at least 40% of the shelter belts in Nebraska were fully intact, which is a pretty high rate, I think. 36 fell in the category of that being carved out or reduced, and then 24% removed. Um, when we look at kind of the data from '03 to 16, we can see over that period of time, we went from 50 to 40. So obviously we are still losing some of these over time. Um, but we're also putting shelter belts, windbreaks back on the landscape um, that, have been post this project time period. So it's not a snapshot of actually all the windbreaks, say, for instance, in the area, and then we also are encouraging shelter belt renovation. We don't have a really good sense of the condition they are in. The Great Plains Windbreak Initiative project did try to get a little quantitative information on quality, but I'll finish up by like, it is to say that these type of plantings do provide multi-generational benefits over time. So again, I don't know anything, Sarah, you want to add to that?
Yeah.
Sarah and Richard did a great paper, also available online. If you click on that QR code, that goes more in depth on this mapping effort.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say the image of the pivot is actually from Antelope County. I think Pam in the chat was mentioning that. The shelter belts were designed prior to pivot irrigation. And so when pivot irrigation came into play, the shelter belts were taken out to incorporate pivots. There was a shelter belt that was had a historical marker that was taken out, and it was very upsetting to the community that the shelter belt was in. And so we are seeing an attachment to the shelter belts, and we're also seeing attachment to the shelter belts through memories, as Gary mentioned, of being a child playing in them. So I think the paper and the report that Gary is talking about is specifically for the Prairie States Forestry Project. And what I found exciting when we did it was that only 24% were removed. So that was kind of an exciting finding, I think, for us in our work. Yeah. Thank you, Gary.
So are these windbreaks obsolete? Sounds like a lot of people on this call don't really think so, but I know there's other people, generally farmers and producers, who maybe think it's an old-fashioned practice.
Yeah, it's a question we get all the time, and I think there's thoughts are like, well, that was a different time period. We're doing different agronomic practices. We got different hybrids and so forth. So have things changed? Um, and I think there is some current research going on their effectiveness, and there's a great project Savannah Institute is launching, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I think when we step back and think about windbreaks as a component in promoting soil health, as this kind of diagram really kind of illustrates, that it's a system of practices that really are key to still dealing with maximizing soil health. And we've got a nice little short tech note on this. You can click on that QR code and go to that tech note that describes it a little bit more in detail. But also, I think there's this maybe misconception that the Dust Bowl era was those type of conditions are not present today. This map shows basically the risk management agencies' disaster payments, indemnity payments. And not that this is tied to specific soil erosion always, but just when we look at loss due to wind and excess wind, it pretty much still occurs across most of the country. And in 2024, there was 190 million paid out, and in other years, even a bit more. And then we still do have dust bowl or dust storm events that are pretty significant and pretty disastrous in ways. Illinois, since this is for the Illinois as, Alliance, a couple years ago, there was a really bad accident due to a dust bowl. And then just a couple weeks ago, there was one in Colorado. So these issues are still present and still need to be addressed.
And we kind of touched on this in an earlier question, but if we're looking not just at Nebraska, but we're talking about the whole internal United States, how are they looking today across the US?
Yeah, yeah. And I'll maybe kind of go through this quick. So I'm still one of us to be able to answer people's questions.
Mhm.
But the National Agroforestry Center, we've conducted a National Agroforestry Producer Survey looking at the 5 common agroforestry practices. Because we know from the Census of Ag, there's over 30,000 producers in the US, at least in 2017, that have at least one of these agroforestry practices. And we conducted a follow-up survey where we sampled about 36% of the entire population and we got a response rate of 52% back, which is pretty phenomenal. And what we found is that over 2,700 producers have windbreaks. It was the most common agroforestry practice among all of the five agroforestry practices. 67% of that population we sampled have windbreaks. And this map shows the number of producers in the states that have windbreaks. And so we can see, obviously the Northern Plains where the project was implemented was high, but even in the Corn Belt region, it's still there a bit. And if we look at percentage of respondents, a fair amount of them of the producers had windbreaks. And also another point is we ask folks like, what's their plans for windbreaks? We hear a lot about people saying they're being taken out, but 20% of our samples said they plan to increase windbreaks. 67% said they plan to keep them. And only 5 said that they were planning on decreasing acreage, which we found fairly positive.
Right. And how are the producers today using these windbreaks?
Yeah. Well, I think it was fascinating that producers were already using them in multiple ways already back in the Prairie States Forestry Project. But what we know is that there are different types of windbreaks, and this kind of our study showed how people are using them. About 43% are using them as field windbreaks. Not surprisingly, our highest use was farmsteads, 60%, but livestock was also up there. I think maybe one of the most exciting data points out of this was that 71% had multiple windbreak types. So probably producers had both, say, a farmstead windbreak, as well as maybe a livestock windbreak or a field windbreak. Then, they were using them for a whole variety of reasons based on what producers told us. And they do vary by what windbreak type, which makes sense. So for livestock, improved livestock welfare was the top ranked benefit by producers. But we do see like wildlife habitat was one of the most common benefits, top ranked benefits across the practices. Interestingly, the wildlife is also one of the top challenges too. And I will mention aesthetics is also in one of the top across these practices. So people do just like the looks of them. And then I think maybe I think this might be our last one on this is people are using them for a variety of products. People are harvesting things from them. So 720 respondents were harvesting edible products like raspberries and walnuts. Folks were harvesting medicinal products and decorative products as well. I think the diversity of things people were collecting from their windbreaks is pretty phenomenal. But maybe what was most interesting to us was that, not surprisingly, the highest use was people for home use or personal use or family use. But 33% of the response said they sold crops or products from their windbreaks. And another about a third planned to sell products. So that's a pretty interesting result that we hope to in the future dive into more.
Great. And Gary, I think you mentioned the National Agroforestry Center will be publishing this data in papers
Yep.
soon.
Those papers are actually in a journal review process right now. We actually heard this week that the windbreak paper was accepted. So we'll just be going through the publication process and hopefully very soon it'll be available and we'll share it out. People can kind of follow Savannah Institute, the National Agroforestry Center, to know when that's out.
Wonderful. And I can talk a little bit about this slide, Gary. So, as you all know, Savannah Institute, we're a little further east of where Gary and Sarah live. We focus more on especially Illinois and Wisconsin and all the surrounding states. And we've launched the Corn Belt Windbreak Project, which I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, but I'll mention it again. We are conducting a very thorough research study alongside researchers at U of I and Iowa State to look at how field windbreaks are acting on the landscape, specifically in Illinois and Iowa. So if you're a producer with a field windbreak or even a windbreak alongside a pasture, we're interested in potentially working with you and doing some research on your farm. So feel free to head to that QR code, Corn Belt survey, fill that out, or if you work in Illinois and Iowa with producers, feel free to share that with everyone. Cool. Well, thank you. Let's get to some questions that were in the chat. Why don't we come back to that species question, Gary? You said you have some
Yeah.
slides on that. Which species did the best from these 30s and 40s plantings?
All right. I think that came from, was that Tom Ward?
It was. Yes.
Not surprised, Tom. So, great question. Here is a table out of the that Munn and Stoke Keller paper, and I highlighted the ones that were in their sample that showed up the most. So the number of rows was basically their number of samples. So like cottonwood was up there, the Siberian elm, honey locust, American elm, hackberry, and green ash were some of the key species that were used the most in that tall and intermediate deciduous species. I've got some on the others. And so you can see that you can kind of see the percent survival ranging from about 60% up to um, 70%, a little higher, almost 80% on the honey locust. So that gives kind of what some of the species that were used and that. Um, let me go. So in terms of conifer, some of the common species used there, eastern red cedar, Rocky Mountain juniper, and ponderosa pine. Again, we can kind of see ponderosa pine down only around 40% survival. Eastern red cedar, Rocky Mountain, better. Again, eastern red cedar native to the area, but obviously aggressive species. And then when we look at shrubs, this list isn't, there's more shrubs. It didn't make it all on this list. The Siberian pea shrub was also a species used a lot. It's below this list, but American plum, Osage orange, Russian olive, and red mulberry were some of the more common ones. And you can kind of see the percent survival there.
And those are a lot of the species that we use when we're designing windbreaks today, are these ones. Not so much Russian olive, but American plum, sometimes Osage orange. I see a lot of those still thriving in Illinois as well. We've had a few questions. I think I want to go through all the questions, even if we go a little bit past 11. John G also asked, has there been a landscape level assessment? Oh, I'm just reading this, and I think we kind of went over this question already. We did already go over that, so I'll share in the chat again the paper of the digitized landscape view.
And that was only done for Nebraska. I think it would be real interesting. It was a pretty time-consuming process for Richard Carmen to do, but with more geospatial techniques these days and machine learning, I think we could, and maybe scanners that could convert those, more automated OCR type readers. There might be opportunities. I believe Kevin Wolves, you're on the call. We might have even discussed that.
If you want to put something in the chat, Kevin, go ahead. Thomas Ward also asked earlier about thinning and the spacing being pretty tight between trees. Do you know what farmers did to manage trees growing really close together?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sarah, you kind of started to hit on that, talking about what were some of the original intentions with these shelter belts. Were they were thinking they were going to be playing a role in wood products, but then the rural electrification came along right about this time, and that shifted. So some of the management that I think was initially thought about didn't happen as much as it was maybe planned to. Um, but it is that paper, the Munns and Stokeller, also kind of said it was interesting. The tight spacing did allow for forest-like conditions to start to develop in belts that were 5 to 6 rows in width. And when they were less, they didn't see, organic matter buildup in the belts. They were, getting kind of burned out with sun and wind exposure in them. So, but yeah, thinning probably would be, none of these are ever walk away practices.
I think too, I mean, we do have a slide, I think it's slide 45. One of the things in the archive is the next slide, one more slide. We do see farmers made tools and they did make on-site modifications. And so the tight spacing was one of those areas that we saw a lot of modification and then a lot of different types of tools created in order to manage them as well.
Great. And you can see these tools from the 40s in the archive, which is
Yeah.
super interesting. Kate asked, are there any lessons that you think current agroforestry technical assistance providers can learn from the PSFP? And anything maybe we can learn not to do?
Gary, I'll let you take that one. That's a good question.
I think there are. I think we're going to be still kind of teasing those apart. I think one of them kind of got mentioned before, which is something we kind of try to do already, but is the bottom up and top down approach. And another thing too, that these were all like there wasn't a standard template that was forced upon landowners. They were allowed, they worked with them to shape the planting. That's why there's variability in the species, was variability in the widths and so forth, because they were engaged in kind of shaping that to a degree. Um, I think some of there's probably lessons still to be learned around some of the marketing aspect. Could be another area to be explored. But yeah, I think there's a lot more to maybe tease apart. I don't know if you have other kind of thoughts on that, Sarah.
No, I think it's just such a rich project and being able to understand the system and the infrastructure for the project. I think one of the areas that we're looking into is the nursery system that was co-developed as part of it, because so many seedlings were needed. So lots of really interesting details that have both strengths and limitations. So also being able to identify the limitations of the project and the negative impacts, I think, are important as well.
I see
Cool.
one asking on like the direction, and they're correct. The wind roses show predominantly southern winds, particularly in the summer, which are more the hotter, drier winds that kind of not. You can get erosion obviously in winter, and those tend to come in this region around out of the north, northeast, northwest. But that is why we saw predominantly the windbreaks were orientated east to west. Um, but in an ideal situation, if you're really wanting to try to kind of provide that best protection, probably an angled or a windbreak with multiple legs at 90 would be kind of ideal.
And you're referencing those wind roses were across that whole
Yep.
Shelterbelt zone.
Yeah, and the mapping they had both winter and summer for the data they had at that point showing what was the direction. And wind roses you can Google, they're available today for aiding in planning design because they will vary regionally and locally just due to topography and other kind of factors.
Great. Okay, well, I saw one more question from Brittany. What are modern day incentives for ag producers to adopt hedges and windbreaks? Maybe name one or so. CRP shout out.
Yeah, I mean, there's still programs that are provided both at the federal and sometimes state level that help with implementation. But I think in terms of if I understood the question, like what would be one of the reasons, and I think some of the research we're seeing is a real benefit again is under some of these really years we have dry conditions, that yield benefits is what that's when the yield benefits really seem to kind of show up. Uh, and so just with more variability these days, kind of hedging your bets with a variety of practices that can kind of maintain that resiliency is kind of one of the reasons I think.
Sarah, do you want to add anything else?
I mean, just thank you so much for having us. I know we've hit our time, but I've really enjoyed the conversation and the additional level of knowledge that Gary has added to interpreting the project. So, yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, it was wonderful having you two share your knowledge with us and share some insights from the new digital archive. I encourage everyone to check that out and look at some of the amazing photos and information that they have on there. Reminder, they didn't have computers back then and did a lot of stuff by hand. And if our ancestors, you could say, could do that, I think we can definitely get some really cool stuff done in the 21st century. So thanks everyone for coming. I'll send out the recording afterwards, and I think this will be up on YouTube. So have a great weekend, everyone, and go plant some trees.